guys, and welcome to yet another Betwixt the Books reviews. Guess what? We're doing like a bajillion day reviews in a row, which means content, so that's good. And also, this review marks another checkbox on our reading challenge because one of our challenges was to read a book translated into English, and today we're talking about The Perfect Nine by Ngugiwa Thiong'o, which was translated from Gakoyo from the author because he also speaks English. So yeah, here we go. This one's interesting because it is an epic, so it is poetry, it is written in verse. It is a creation story about the people of Kenya, the different tribes within Kenya and how they came to be, or a retelling of that creation story. And it's supposedly a feminist take on that. But we're going to be talking about that when we talk about our opinions and we talk about the book in general. So let's start with our overall opinions.
Okay, so I just want to be upfront about something, which is that I feel that in order to be a good reviewer is cumulative, right? So you are able to review things because you put things in context within all the other things that you've read and judge then if it's a good or a bad representation of a certain thing. I think one of the issues about reviewing The Perfect Nine is that I don't read much epic poetry, and therefore it is incredibly hard to put this in context with other things that I've read, because you can't put epic poetry alongside a romance novel or a YA fantasy. Those things are not the same. So I want to say that right up front. I think in general, I enjoyed this. It was very different from things that I had otherwise read. I have read things like Gilgamesh and Beowulf for school, but this was interesting because it, A, wasn't for school, which makes it different, and B, was updated, was supposed to be a modern retelling as opposed to, Beowulf, which always just kind of hurts my head. I did think that it being called a feminist take on this myth was a little bit funky just based on things that happened in it, which we'll talk about, but also never having read the original, again, that's a qualified statement, but calling it feminist when certain things happen, question. And also, the thing about epic poetry, which I know, is that it focuses a lot on things that are like big speeches and then kind of rolls over like more actiony bits. I like the actiony bits, and I don't like the talky bits. So for me, that wasn't super great, but that is just an element of epic poetry. So again, I don't feel comfortable giving this a star rating, but I definitely enjoyed this, and I'm so glad that this was one of our challenges.
I'll concur. I also have not read a lot of epic poetry. I commented at one point, I don't know if it was in the comments of one of our videos or just in general, where I talked about how I struggle a lot with poetry. I try to read it and I feel like I don't understand it, or I don't understand the form, or it like frustrates me in a lot of ways. And those feelings happened here, where I feel like I can't talk about it because I'm missing something. Like I wasn't able to fully grasp everything that was going on. Not that this was incomprehensible. It was very comprehensible. It was modern language. Like reading old epics versus reading this is a very different experience. And it's one of the reasons why I picked up this new translation of Beowulf by Maria Devana Hadley? Ooh. Last names are hard, guys, but this is supposedly the same sort of thing, taking Beowulf and putting it into modern language. So maybe if I were to read this, I could have a conversation about these two together, the same sort of thing of an epic, modern epic, something like that. But I haven't read this yet, so I can't like talk about these two in conversation. But it's definitely different than old epics in Old English, or translated to sound old. Some of the verbiage shows, the words that are physically chosen to put on the page are quite modern, to the point where it like feels maybe slightly incongruous to the format, and we'll talk about that as well. I put this at 3 stars. It was, I think, 3.25 on Storygraph, but it's one of those ones where like I was like, it was good. I enjoyed it. I flew through it because it's a poem and it's quite short. But it also, like, at the same time, we came out of it going, I have thoughts, but I don't know that I can give a comprehensive review of it. So keep that in mind. We're both coming from the point of view of we have thoughts about the stuff that we read, but we might not be the best reviewers of this book in particular.
So let's talk about definitions. This is, again, the translator, the author is the same person, so there's that, and they say in the beginning of the book that this is their attempt at a feminist retelling of this creation myth. Now, feminist and feminism is also a word that can be defined differently by different people. It means different things to different people. So when someone says to me a feminist retelling, what I think might not necessarily be what they mean in the context. But one of the issues that I took with calling this a feminist retelling is based on my definition of feminism. And my definition of feminism kind of goes down to choice. You know, whatever a woman chooses to do, as long as it's her choice, that's feminism, as opposed to like women must be mothers, stay-at-home mothers. If that's a woman's choice, that's one thing. If they're forced to do that, that's another. And so this is a myth where there are 10 daughters of these two people and 99 suitors show up at their mountain and say, we want to marry your daughters. And they all get into a tizzy when they're like, are y'all gonna divide by like groups and a bunch of you marry each daughter? They're like, no, 1-to-1 ratio, please. So the parents of the daughters send them off on this epic journey. But outside of one dude, there actually does not seem to be an element of choice. It is just that the 9 daughters and 9 suitors make it back alive. Everybody else, all the other suitors die. So while there is a suggestion, because a lot of the suitors, they don't necessarily maybe die, but a lot of them will turn back, or they choose not to continue on along the way, while some of them do die. There is an idea that the men are choosing to either continue or not continue based on their desire to wed one of the daughters. But you don't necessarily see the daughters making any kind of choice. Even when the 9 daughters and the 9 men come back, we don't know how each one of them chooses which one to marry. We have no idea. So to me, I was a little bit lost on how you can necessarily call something feminist if the women don't really seem to have a choice. They're sent on this mission by their parents. They're sent with all the suitors. The men make the decision to stay on it or leave or die, I guess. A lot of them die because they're dumb. And then you don't see them even making a choice about which one they marry. So that was a little bit confusing to me, I guess. Now, Michaela and I have been discussing this, and I'm going to turn it over to Michaela to talk about what about this maybe might actually be feminist. Teamwork.
For me, I think I can see where they're going with the feminist argument here. And it is often reiterated that the women can do everything the men can do. They go on this trek together. The women survive the trek as well. There's one point in the story where a bunch of men actually think that the women are witches because there's no way that these women could be doing the same things the men are doing if the men are dying. Like, they must be having some sort of weird magic power, and this has all been a giant scheme to bewitch them. And then half of the men are like, no, you guys should go, and they get into a fight, and the men who thought that they were witches end up leaving. But that's the element of feminism, I think, for Ngugi wa Thiong'o here, is that men and women are equally capable. The only other element of it is that, especially in the second half of the poem, every time they come up against a challenge that isn't like a physical challenge, but is some sort of tricksy element, the women are the ones that come up with good solutions to those problems usually. There's one man, and he was mentioned already as the one who was possibly part of the last daughter's choice, who also comes up with some pretty good solutions to things. But otherwise, that's the only like feminist element to it, is women are equal to men, which is true, but I think that modern feminism has progressed past the point of just men and women can do the same things. There's other elements to feminism that is incorporated today. And this could be very different from the original poem, and that might be why it's considered such a feminist version, because we haven't read the original poem or the original story. We don't know it. We're not Kenyan, so we can't really say what the original story said versus this one. It just feels a little incongruous to us. So there's those elements. Those are feminist elements, but they seem like very base level feminism.
Another part of this that maybe could be considered feminist is also something that makes it kind of weird. So the first half or third of the poem is told in the third person, but when the daughters and their suitors go off on their mission, it switches to be a point of view of the daughters. And so it changes perspective pretty drastically without any kind of warning. It just goes. So you could say, okay, awesome, the daughters are telling their own story, but they weren't the whole time. And why did we need to switch from third person to their perspective? Because third person could have carried it through. I literally just was teaching a teen writing class where we did something on perspective, and I was sitting there hammering home to them, you have to stick with one perspective throughout your story or it confuses people. And then I read this and I was like, Exhibit A.
I want to also add that this book is obviously a translated book, and while it was translated from the author, which means that we more than likely have a pretty good adaptation with not a lot of changes from the original vision, with poetry, language is hard to translate. As someone who took courses in college on translation, poetry is one of the hardest to translate because it's really difficult to get the same rhythm, the same meter, the same rhyme schemes. There might be elements of this poem that we don't get because we're getting it in English. And we don't speak the original language, so we can't really hear, like, was there supposed to be wordplay here? Was there supposed to be rhyming here? Has the meter changed at all because it's no longer in the original language? That's something that is always lost with translation, or can be lost. It's really hard to maintain all of those things and have it still be comprehensible. So there's a chance that the language structure in here might be very different between the two languages. There were times when I felt like the sentence structure here was very repetitive, like words were being repeated over and over again, but slightly different over and over again, and it felt clunky in English, and I don't know if it would be as clunky in Kenyan. Like, it might be a language where they use different endings or different prefixes to change something, so it's the same word over and over again, slightly changed, rather than like 3 words in slightly different orders. It's something that I noticed, and something that somebody else might notice, and it's just something to keep in mind when reading a translation, especially a poetry translation, that we may have lost something in the translation. That, like, there's no workaround for that. That's just something that happens.
So with that, I have not taken classes in translation, but I have taken classes in poetry. And so I don't know if you noticed this when we showed it the first time, but this book has a very small trim size. This is not a normal sized book. And I thought that maybe it was because this is an epic poem, they're trying to make it into a book-length text. And so, you know, you make it smaller and there's more pages because the words seem to go that way. But the weird thing about that was what it did to the line breaks. And, you know, in poetry, where you break a line, where a line ends on the page, as well as in the sentence, is very, very specific, and it's meaningful. And for the most part, this is a poem where the first letter of every sentence, whether or not it's a new sentence or not, is capitalized. But throughout the book, you get these things where some of the sentences have to continue on to another line. And I also wondered if that was part of the thing that made the structure of it very weird, because in the original, for example, did this all sit on one line. Because I don't think these are necessarily meant to be their own line. It's not meant to be a line break. And you can tell because it's not capitalized, but because of the weird trim size, they had to break it to fit the page. So I think it also contributes to the reading experience. With that being said, this is also broken up into very small chapters like this, with this really cute artwork with this layered mountain, which is really awesome. And there are things like, you know, the journey, and let's see, what's the next one here? The ogre and the cure-all hair. And these were all they feel very epic poetry. And I was like, all right. There's just this one, and I'm just gonna share it with you guys because I laughed so hard. And I don't necessarily think that I was supposed to be laughing. This is not a funny story, but all of a sudden I hit this and I just had to stop and just be like, what is happening? And it is the ogre that shat without stopping. So there you go. That, no context, it just is what it is.
There is one last thing that we want to talk about, but it is slightly spoilery, so if you are the type of person who wants to pick up this book and wants to read it, it's really short. I would recommend at least giving it a shot, especially because we don't really get modern epics. Most of the epics that I think of are like quite old translations into modern, but they're not like new epics, so it might be worth reading just for that. But there's one very thing at the end, slight spoiler about the content of the poem. So again, if you want to skip this, skip ahead. I'll leave my finger up, so when you see either Gretchen pop up or my finger go down, you should be good. The 10th sister, because this is the perfect 9, there are 9 sisters, and then there is a 10th sister who is crippled. She's born with a deformity of her legs, and part of the journey that the sisters go on is they need to get this cure-all hair from the ogre that Gretchen mentioned in order to cure their sister so that she can walk and be whole again. Some issues with that for some disability folks. In order to be whole, you must be cured of any disabilities. She was fully functioning. She was able to shoot arrows better than everybody else. It was perfectly fine. She is also the one who gets to sort of choose her suitor, because the only named man, the only suitor who does things of his own volition and like seems to be interesting, chooses her actually, and he's doing this whole journey without her because she can't go on it because of her disability. He chose her before she could even be cured. So he was one of my favorite characters. At the very end, when they're all getting married, the king and queen said, you know, you all have to live here, and he said, I really want to take her back home to my family so that she can meet my family, which was one of the caveats of the journey, was like, hey, all of our daughters have to stay here, so if you don't want to live here with us, then you can just leave. Like, you can't be one of the suitors. That doesn't work. And he comes at the end and says, I really want to take her. She chooses to go with him. You know, they both leave, and then the next chapter she comes back and he's died off screen. She sort of gives us this story of like what happened. He got attacked by a lion and she's made her way back home, which makes it feel like they were punished for, you know, disobeying the grandparents or the mother and father in this instance. But that was so frustrating because he's the only named male suitor that we see. He's the only one that seems to be doing things for his chosen one. He chose her even though she had a deformity. He's doing all of these great valor, and then he just dies off screen and we don't really get to see it. And it's like, oh, why did we spend all of this time investing in this character just for him to die off screen? It didn't feel like great. And then it felt like she was being punished for trying to be her own person. So not the best ending. Made us both frustrated, Gretchen and I. So that's another reason why probably we're like, God, this could have been really good, and then it got frustrating. So just wanted to lay that out there as well.
Again, we're both really glad that we read this, especially for me, this was outside of my comfort zone. Michaela does, as she said, she's done classes in translation and does enjoy reading translated books. I don't as often, as part of the reason we put this on our reading challenge. And so we really enjoyed the academic experience of reading this and discussing it with each other. We might, again, we're definitely not necessarily the most knowledgeable people to review this, but we have done our best and hopefully said something of interest. You know, this book was longlisted for the Man Booker International Prize, so clearly there are people who are far more academic than we are who have said, yes, this. but we had our own issues with it. And again, maybe it is just because we define feminism differently. It is a word with a lot of definitions to a lot of different people. But our review is our opinion, and we hope that instead of dissuading you from picking up this book, if you're like, yeah, translated epic poetry that is modern, go ahead and get this from your local library. That's what I did. So try it out. It's a really fast read. I read it in one sitting on my couch, and let us know down in the comments if you pick it up and what your own opinion is. We love, above all else, having the discussion about these books. So if you choose to read it, do comment down there. Even if you don't choose to read it, have a discussion with us anyway. We're up for it. Like Michaela said, we are actually planning on doing quite a few reviews in a row. We've already done The Last Fallen Star previously, and we're planning an Own Voices LGBTQ romance and epic fantasy book coming up next, because this is Betwixt the Books and nothing makes any logical sense. You're here for the variety though. So we'll see you next time, and have a great night. Bye guys.